Thousands of Iraqi troops and hundreds of tanks crossed the border into Kuwait in the early hours of this morning.
August 1990. Iraqi forces invade Kuwait.
The invasion force crossed the frontier at 2 a.m. and swiftly advanced on the capital 80 miles to the south.
Thousands of foreign nationals, oil workers, teachers, businessmen are suddenly trapped in Iraq and Kuwait. Borders are restricted and flights are cancelled. But then a worrying report arrives. A group of foreign nationals was picked up from their home and transported under guard to an oil refinery just outside Baghdad. Similar reports follow. Other groups of foreigners were brought to a large dam in northern Iraq. Others show up at a munition testing area, an airfield, a missile factory, and the pattern is gradually becoming clear. Many of those being moved are British. Others are American, French, and Japanese. The governments of these countries are building up military forces in Saudi Arabia and in the Persian Gulf. These foreign nationals are placed at locations that could become targets if coalition forces decide to attack Iraq. Then Saddam Hussein appears on TV with one of the families.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart? And with cornflakes too.
The hostage crisis has begun. Throughout the 1980s, Iraq had fought a long and devastating war against neighboring Iran. The conflict lasted 8 years and left thousands of people dead. It also left Iraq deeply in debt. Saddam Hussein believed that Kuwait should help carry that burden. Instead, relations between the two countries deteriorated. Iraq accused Kuwait of driving down oil prices, costing Baghdad billions of dollars in revenue. Saddam also claimed that Kuwait was extracting oil from a disputed field along the border. The accusations grew louder.
Iraq may be planning to develop the port of Qasr for its oil exports, but needs control of the Kuwaiti islands of Warba and Bubiyan to secure a passage for its ships.
Iraqi troops then began gathering near Kuwait. Then, in the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces crossed the border. The Kuwaiti defenses collapsed within hours, and Iraq is now effectively controlling Kuwait.
Iraq's 1 million men under arms makes it extremely difficult for anyone to remove them from Kuwait militarily. Saudi Arabia has 75,000 men, and other Gulf states have about 70,000 troops. They collaborate loosely, but they'd never take on Iraq.
Much of the world sided with Kuwait. Military forces began moving into the region. Saddam Hussein became increasingly concerned that Iraq itself could be invaded, as coalition troops gathered in neighboring Saudi Arabia. Countries from around the world joined.
United States troops have begun arriving in Saudi Arabia.
Some Egyptian troops have already arrived in Saudi Arabia. Others are on their way from Egypt and from other states in the Persian Gulf.
If Iraq remained isolated and coalition forces continued building up in Saudi Arabia, Saddam Hussein risked facing both an economic blockade and a military confrontation at the same time. And as the crisis escalated, thousands of foreigners suddenly found themselves caught in the middle. Iraq had a population of roughly 18 million people and a modest foreign population. Most were from Arab and Asian countries, but there were some Europeans and Americans. But Kuwait was a different story. Of their population of roughly 2.1 million, well over half were foreigners. Some 4,000 British lived in Kuwait City, as well as 2,500 Americans. These were business people, teachers, oil workers. When they saw Iraqi tanks roll into their city, many packed their bags and headed for airports. Others drove toward border crossings. While some managed to leave the country in the first days after the Iraqi invasion, many started getting turned back. Flights stopped operating normally. Border restrictions tightened. Days passed as the situation grew more confusing. Then an order arrives.
In Kuwait City, Americans who survived the Iraqi invasion but have not been able to leave Kuwait were ordered today to report to a downtown hotel for their own protection against unspecified threats and do it within 2 hours.
In Kuwait City, American citizens are instructed to report at the International Hotel, and British nationals receive a similar order to report at the Regency Hotel. Nobody knows what the authorities are planning.
Few Americans are complying with the order to move to the hotel. But the British government, which received a similar order for 4,000 British citizens, did.
While no one here in Washington will actually say the word hostage, there are private fears that that is just what the Americans and the British are becoming.
Then, any remaining doubt was removed. Saddam announced that the nationals of countries that are plotting against Iraq will not be allowed to leave until coalition forces retreat from the region. Thousands of people are suddenly held up inside Iraq and occupied Kuwait.
But when Saddam Hussein specifically offers to trade the freedom of those citizens of many nations he holds against their will in return for concessions, there can be little doubt that whatever these innocent people are called, they are in fact hostages.
At first, most people believed that it was temporary. But Iraqi officials then started rounding up foreign nationals. They were picked up at home and from work. They were transported under guard to hotels and other temporary holding centers.
The United States says it's concerned over the whereabouts of 28 Americans taken from their hotels in Kuwait to an unknown destination.
In Baghdad, many were first brought to the Melia Hotel, which had become one of the largest holding centers in the country. Once they arrived there, they were kept under armed guard. Some were kept there for hours. Most stayed for several days in uncertainty. Then buses arrived. They were divided into small groups and were ordered to board. These foreign nationals were then taken to seemingly random sites. The first reports came in about foreigners that were taken to the Dora oil facilities in the outskirts of the city. Others were transported north to the largest refinery in the country. Another group is reportedly moved to a nuclear complex just south of the capital. Others at missile and ammunition facilities near Mosul and Alexandria. The hostages are not being held up in prisons. They are being scattered across Iraq's most important infrastructure. They are human shields. Saddam Hussein takes the strategy public.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart? And with cornflakes too.
Saddam appears on Iraqi television surrounded by military officials and with a British family, 2 parents, 3 teenage boys and a 5-year-old, Stuart Lockwood.
I don't think all Iraqi kids can get cornflakes now.
The scene is strangely ordinary. Saddam smiles. He appears almost friendly. The man in the back repeatedly pats the boy on the head, except neither the boy nor his family are there by choice.
Our families know we're in an unknown destination, but we would like them to know that we are fit and well.
Millions of people around the world see these clips. Saddam wants Western audiences to see the people that he is holding, to remember their faces, and to remember that if war comes, they could be caught in the middle. The broadcast caused a huge international backlash.
Hussein is trying to win a public relations war using the Western news media. His techniques so far have evoked worldwide revulsion.
Saddam responded by offering to release all women and children.
And even relatives of those detained doubt whether the offer to release women and children only will be fully welcomed.
Under that policy, Stuart, his brother and mother are later released.
The hostage flight had waited for Reverend Jesse Jackson to arrive in Baghdad from Kuwait with 30 sick or elderly US citizens.
If war were to break out in the Persian Gulf, it would be a devastating blow to the nervous system, the backbone of Western industrialized nations. If talks are impossible, then war is inevitable. So let's talk.
Outside Iraq, the pressure continues to build. After the king agrees to host foreign forces, American troops begin arriving at bases near the kingdom's Persian Gulf coast, just a few hundred miles from the Kuwaiti border.
Every night in the desert, his men are rehearsing for war. The Marines train after dark because it's not so hot, and because that is when they expect to fight.
British, French, Egyptian, and Syrian forces also deploy to Saudi territory.
The Gulf force is getting bigger by the day, more than 20 ships now, some 500 planes and 200,000 men in the area generally.
Each vessel packs more firepower than the entire US Navy had in World War II. and many of the planes can fly more than twice the speed of sound.
Farther east, coalition warships gather in the Persian Gulf and in the Gulf of Oman.
A defensive posture for now, but if Saddam Hussein does not pull out of Kuwait, Pentagon sources say that U.S. forces are prepared to go on the offensive.
Saddam's intention with the hostages was to prevent a buildup of coalition forces, but there's no sign of slowing down. A broad arc of military power is now forming around Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Every week, the possibility of military action grows more real, and Iraq is given a deadline. Iraq had to leave Kuwait by January 15, and if they didn't comply, the UN authorized its member states to use all necessary means to restore Kuwait's sovereignty. Saddam was pushed in a corner. At the same time, efforts are underway to free the hostages. In November 1990, one of the most famous men in the world arrives in Iraq, Muhammad Ali. The images make headlines around the world. The former heavyweight champion meets Saddam in Baghdad and appeals for the release of American hostages. This comes at a moment when Saddam is searching for a way to ease the pressure. The coalition continues to grow. More troops arrive in Saudi Arabia. International sanctions remain in place. Saddam had hoped that the hostages would strengthen his position, but instead they are becoming increasingly costly. Releasing some of them offers a potential diplomatic opening. It allows Saddam to present himself as a leader who is willing to negotiate rather than to simply confront. And gradually, after Ali's visit to Baghdad, small groups of hostages begin leaving Iraq.
Some of the British hostages who arrived home this morning spent months hiding from Iraqi troops in Kuwait. Others had been part of Saddam Hussein's human shield and were imprisoned at strategic sites such as power stations and military bases.
For a moment, it appears that diplomacy might still work.
Following some emotional airport reunions, the first batch of Britons to return since Saddam Hussein's general amnesty left for home. And in Blackpool, Roy Johnson saw his new son Benjamin for the first time. The infant was born 3 weeks ago when Roy was still in hiding in Kuwait and aching to be home for the birth.
For the first time since the crisis began, Saddam's system of human shields is starting to show cracks. But hostages are still trapped at strategic sites. The coalition is still preparing for war. Every week, more troops arrive in Saudi Arabia, and Saddam Hussein's strategy appears not to be working. The human shields had been intended to make military action politically difficult, but preparations for war continue. And the longer that the hostages remain in Iraq, the greater the diplomatic cost becomes.
This is evil. The things that are going on in Kuwait are terrifying. They are brutal. And most people understand that evil has to be stopped.
Governments around the world condemn the policy. Even countries that oppose military action are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Iraq's treatment of foreign civilians. Saddam was still hoping to avoid a military confrontation. He was looking for a diplomatic outcome that allowed him to keep at least some of the gains of the invasion. The hostages were meant as leverage, but now they are increasingly becoming a liability.
There are more than 6,000 Western and Japanese citizens still detained or hiding in Iraq and Kuwait, 930 of them Americans.
He ordered the release of small groups of hostages, then larger groups. By December 1990, the remaining Western hostages are all allowed to leave.
After 4 months and 4 days in captivity, hostages learned that President Saddam Hussein would release them all, both in Iraq and those hiding in Kuwait, unconditionally and immediately.
The hostage crisis is over, or at least it changed form.
The ground war in the Gulf has started. It started at around 1 o'clock in the morning, our time.
On January 17, 1991, the air campaign began. Coalition aircraft entered Iraqi airspace. Cruise missiles struck targets across the country. After months of threats, sanctions, and diplomacy, the efforts to force Iraq out of Kuwait entered a new phase. The foreign hostages were now gone, but in a sense, the strategy had not disappeared. Iraq often placed military assets in civilian areas. Iraqi authorities sometimes prevented civilians from evacuating certain areas. Saddam was deliberately creating a situation in which civilian casualties could become politically useful. The human cost of war was once again becoming part of the battle itself. Saddam Hussein saw civilians as instruments of strategy. When foreign civilians didn't deliver results, the names and faces simply changed.